Hello everyone, my name is Jake Hafley, and today I'd like to talk about some 3D printer upgrades. Over the summer I purchased my first ever 3D printer, the Ender 3 Pro. Since then, I've learned how to use Fusion 360 to model my own parts. I love this thing and it barely gets any breaks away from me. But since then, I've been running the printer with all stock parts. Online I've seen many different upgrades for the Ender 3, and I decided now is a better time than ever to try out how some of them do. Today, I'd like to talk about the different upgrades I'm going to install and how they could help me in the future. The first upgrade that I added to my printer was probably the easiest one to install. This should be the 4 new flat springs and aluminum gears to adjust the bed of the printer. The stock springs on the Ender 3 were not flat at the top or the bottom of them, so it could lead to a slight imbalance on the bed of the printer. The pack that I got also came with metal gears, which were a nice addition to replace the stock plastic ones. One thing I immediately noticed after putting the new springs on were how stiff they were. This makes sense since they had not been pressed down or applied to anything before. With enough force pressing down on the bed, I got the springs and gears tightened to about what they were before. I will obviously have to level the bed again before doing any printing, but I'm going to have a bunch more upgrades, so I'm going to wait to do that. The next upgrade was the one that I was the most excited for, which is the Silent Stepper Motor motherboard. The specific board is the Creality 1.1.5 Silent motherboard. I was surprised at how much work this took to install, but it made more sense once I thought about the working pieces of the printer itself. I initially took off the plate and tried replacing the LCD screen board, thinking that was the motherboard at the bottom right of my printer. And I was obviously very wrong. Apparently on an Ender 3 Pro, you have to flip the machine over and unscrew it from the bottom to get to the motherboard. After some heavy lifting, I got my printer set up in a good spot though. The hardest part about this replacement was that there was glue on all the connectors on the motherboard, and meaning I had to pick them all off without damaging the wires with a pair of tweezers. After this was done, I unscrewed the other wires on the tops of the connectors so that they could also be pulled out. I should have also kept better track of which of these wires went where in the connectors, as I kept having to cross-reference with the source online since mine was already taken apart. After most of the connectors were swapped though, I decided to screw the new motherboard in to the bottom of the printer. After the last few parts were put back in, I plugged in the motherboard fan and flipped my Ender 3 back over. I was a little scared turning it back on, especially since I had to reconnect the power supply and everything, but I did a well enough job because it booted up fine. When I set my printer to go back to the bottom left corner of my bed to home, my jaw dropped. When I say the motors were silent, I mean literally silent. Like, there was nothing. All I can hear now are the fans, and it makes me wonder how quiet I can make this thing. I'll play it before and after just so you know I'm not going crazy. This was by far worth the purchase, and this seems like such a nice quality of life change that I'll appreciate for a long time. A lot of the reason I appreciate this so much is because my printer runs on the same room I sleep in, which I'm sure a lot of other people are in that situation too, and if you ever have to have something that loud running in your room, you'll realize that you don't want to. But this takes a huge stress off of the sound because since the motors are silent, the fans are always consistent, but sometimes the motors would make this weird cutting sound as it would zip around the bed, but that's not there anymore. Next, I wanted to add the glass bed. The physical install for this was the most straightforward out of any of these parts. All I had to do was use 4 crocodile clips on the front and back of the bed to attach it. To make sure the printer worked well with this, I lowered the nozzle by changing the Z-axis just enough to the point where it was touching the glass bed. Then I unscrewed the 2 screws holding in the Z-axis limit on the side of the printer. Whenever it gets touched, it tells the Ender 3 that it has gone as low as it can and it needs to stop. This works well since I would have had to do this anyways since the screws are too stiff to go as low as my stock springs did. After some bed leveling, it worked just like I hoped it would. The main benefit to having a glass bed is that so you know each corner of the bed is the same height. A problem I was having with the magnetic piece that came with the stock printer is that the middle of the bed was higher than the corners. This led to problems with sticking to the bed or being too close right in the middle. I was curious at how the glass bed does compared to this, but I have high hopes. Also, to note, I accidentally left the magnetic adhesion plate below the glass bed on the first time, but that was easy to take off and recook the glass bed. I don't know why I did this and didn't think to take it off because you can literally peel it off, but I didn't, and then it had issues with the first layer starting too high, and I just had to readjust it later. But this helped fix my problems with the starting layer height for a test print. The next thing I wanted to add was the metal extruder parts that were used to feed the plastic filament into the Bowden tube. This is another quality of life upgrade that just helps the plastic parts from wearing down as fast. Since all the plastic for your prints comes through this, it's important to have a reliable feeder for your filament. After following a tutorial online on how to take apart the stock extruder and how to assemble my new one, everything was set up nicely. This was very straightforward to do, and mostly it was just putting screws and mounting the two metal parts to the printer. This is something that a lot of people have recommended online, and I'm interested to see how it helps my prints or makes my Ender 3 last longer. The second to last upgrade I wanted to add today was Octoprint software with a Raspberry Pi to my printer. I got a Raspberry Pi starter kit that included an SD card, power supply, and everything else I would need to run the software for my prints. I also got a camera so I can monitor my prints from my computer and record time-lapse videos in the future. This upgrade took the most time to install. The kit my Raspberry Pi 3 came in had a nice case to put it in too. In the future I plan on printing parts to mount it to the actual printer, but for now I think this will just get the job done. Once in the case, I plugged in the switch, power adapter, and the longer ribbon cable for the camera. The next thing I had to do was install the firmware on an SD card. I did this by burning the Octoprint software from my desktop computer onto the SD card. I then loaded it into the Raspberry Pi so it would install when it booted up. I then connected my Pi to our Wi-Fi with an Ethernet cable and found its IP address from a scanner on my desktop computer. After typing in that IP address in Google, I was able to use the Octoprint GUI from my desktop. This lets me monitor my prints through the camera, change temperatures, move the bed, and many more things. The thing I'm most looking forward to is loading G-code and prints from my desktop instead of using an SD card to run back and forth between my printer and computer. There's also many plugins on Octoprint to fully customize it to really do whatever you need. The final change I brought to my printer was a new Bowden tube that would guide the filament to the extruder nozzle. I believe that this was the reason my printer was having issues with getting clogged and not evenly extruding filament from the nozzle. With this part, I got a tube, clippers, and metal pieces to attach them to the feeder and nozzle. I unscrewed the couplings on both ends of the tube to remove it for the old stock part on my Ender 3, then I measured how long it was so I could cut my new tubing to match it. After that, I put a smaller coupling on one end of the tube and screwed the larger coupling onto the extruder. After that, I fed the other end of the tube into the extruder and nozzle so that the filament could get pushed all the way through. I'm hoping this will fix my problems with under extrusion, and I think it will after looking at the stock tube. Overall, this is a great way to learn more about my printer while bringing tons of quality of life changes and fixes that I've been needing for a while. I feel like I learned at least one thing about each different part of my Ender 3, and it helps me understand more in general about how these printers work. This will come in handy whenever my next issue or upgrades come along. Thank you so much for watching my video, and if you want to see more from me, subscribe or check out my content below. See you next time.